Hello and welcome to the Swing Smarter Hitting Training Podcast. This is your host, Joey Myers from hittingperformancelab.com. And I have the honor today. I met through Brian Eisenberg and his son, for those of you who have listened to Play Ball Kid, Sammy. And I was talking to Brian the other day, and he brought up Jason Colleran's name. So I want to leave a mystery because we're going to go into that. But welcome to the show, Jason.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Jason, you all are going to you're going to love what we have to talk about today, what Jason has to talk about today. And first, give a brief background about you, Jason.
I played baseball at least 20 years. Now I've been on the training side of it, and I wouldn't say the medical side, but I'll consult for medical professionals. So, having been through the injuries, seeing the rehabilitation process, and now having to help out on the medical side with kind of bridging the gap with, the technology and kind of the training. So I opened up Elite Edge Training Center, started a sports performance center and kind of muscle lab in 2011. And then 2 years ago, we launched the Kinetic Arm. So having the skill set with all the manual muscle testing and the neuromuscular system and learning about external forces or, resistance mechanics, I thought, I've seen how the surgical outcomes are, how the training programs are. So just kind of, followed the science and gathered data and was able to design an external muscular system that we can now offload stress from the throwing arm and keep the elbow and shoulder healthy.
Love that. And so we had a talk before this on just getting to know each other. We hadn't been connected until Brian said it and I reached out. And a lot of people are familiar with strength conditioning out there. A lot of people have performance gyms and things like that. But there's one thing that really, now one of probably many things that differentiates you from others, and it's MAT. Explain MAT a little bit.
So with muscle activation techniques, it's a very precise form of neuromuscular testing. So people are more concerned with how bright the bulb is, and they don't know if the switch works, which is kind of like they're more concerned with, let's say, velocity or maxing out on a lift. But you don't know if everything's functioning as well as it can. So we look at, tightness as secondary to weakness. So we got to remember that muscles tighten up for a reason. So we actually identify the cause of the problem versus just treating the symptom, which in baseball, we've got all these arm care programs. We've got all these experts, but we've got to step back and think, maybe we need to go back further down the chain and understand that with the best arm care problem in the world, if there's dysfunction at the foot, the hip, the trunk, it doesn't matter how strong your arm is, you're still going to have problems.
Yeah, we just one of my hitters, he's a growing kid, his brother. So he's a sophomore now in high school. He's taller than me now, and he's got an older brother who's playing. He's a redshirt freshman playing at Fresno State, catcher. It's really good, great family. And he just, I don't know exactly what the diagnosis was, but I saw the X-ray and there was a gap right here at the elbow. So he had broken, fractured, something. Wow. And part of it was growing pains. Part of it, he's a catcher, so he's throwing second most on the field. And then another part, I guess I just got another piece of the information. He just had surgery last Friday to fix it. And I guess it's a 6-week recovery. And then he's going to have another 6 weeks of PT or whatever. So it's 3 months total. And his brother went through the same thing, apparently. But I guess he slid back into the bag at one point, straightened out. And I think that was he was having issues already. And I think that was just the straw that broke the camel's back. But talk a little bit about some of the things you're seeing out there, the pitchers that are coming to you, or just the athletes that are coming to you. I would just say pitchers, because that's what we're talking about today, and what kind of injuries that you're seeing.
So a lot of things that are kind of, I don't want to say going wrong in the industry, but the big obsession with mobility. So a lot of these hip stretches, we're seeing, some torn hip labrums. So people have to remember that range of motion doesn't really matter. They should think more, what is the active range of control? So that's kind of where the muscle testing comes into play. So just because we force a limb all the way back, it'd be kind of foolish to expect it to all of a sudden work there when we can't actively get there on our own. So that's been a big issue, is all these mobility programs, and stretching actually shuts your muscles down. So it's going to decrease your force output. And there's a lot of good data out there. And I can send some studies too. But these are things that they just kind of get regurgitated in baseball. And then with a lot of the heavy lifting as well, a barbell's really not a good training tool. I mean, we're constantly changing directions, and people say, oh, you want a stable core. Stable means still. That's the last thing you would want. you'd actually want an explosive or dynamic core. So a lot of these things, they're causing problems for the arms, especially like a front squat. Like I don't even have that mobility. And to get it, you'd have to cut me open, take a chisel, a belt sander, and get rid of these things called bones that make the joints. But that's something that's not understood in the strength and conditioning world, especially when you get into the mobility side, is that structure dictates function. And people have different shaped bones or different lengths and different shaped joints. So a lot of the popular programs that are out there, I get kids in here that are injured from those. So whether it's the popular weighted ball program or popular 90 mile per hour or whatever, it's not sustainable. So when these kids get these big jumps in velocity from the weighted ball training or all these run and guns, it's great until 1 to 2 weeks later they blow out their arm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, I love how you didn't mention names, and we don't have to mention names on here, and people can figure it out on their own. They've done the research, they've connected the dots, they've been out there. And we can go into those into a little bit more depth on a few of those programs. But one of the things, and you understand like all the fascia stuff, and you understand all that. And that's what I love about MAT. I wanted to, and I told you this, I wanted to do that whole certification, go through that when I was doing my research through Anatomy Trains, Thomas Myers, and I mentioned a couple other names, Dr. Eric Dalton, Dynamic Body, and all these guys. And I think Dr. Eric Dalton specifically was MAT, and I think he might've had his own program and whatnot. I just got busy doing other things. And there's so much research when it comes to marketing, and then there's human movement, and then there's hitting, and then there's so many things that we could be obsessed about. And I just fell off the wayside. But you mentioned something about fascia and how fascia, I think you mentioned something about 2,000 pounds per square inch to be able to deform it or to be able to get it to change shape. And it's almost near impossible to do that. Can you talk on that a little bit? Like tendons, I think.
Yeah, that's another thing with baseball. If you come across somebody that's talking about fascia a lot, just go the other way. They'd be a lot better served in serving their athletes or clients learning about resistance mechanics. So fascia, the collagen fibers that make up fascia, have a 2,000 pound tensile strength. So I've got one research paper with a 3D mathematical model showing you would need well over 2,000 pounds of force, and that's compression shearing, to get even a 1% change in length. And a 1% change in length for ligaments, that's called a grade 1 strain or sprain. So that's an injury. So we've got to think. And then there's another paper they pulled with hundreds of pounds of force on an IT band for hours and still couldn't even get a 1% change in length. So all the stretching and smashing that you're doing, you're really just beating the crap out of your muscle tissue. So you got to think, if I punch you in the shoulder, are you going to perform better or worse? Mm-hmm. Right. Probably not better. Right. So there's not a human being on earth that's going to be able to exert 2,000 pounds of force. And they have to look at it kind of almost like there's some good pictures. It's like a cheeseburger. You've got these different layers. You've got the skin, which gives some, or the hair on the skin, which gives some sensory input. Then you got the skin, then you got the different layers. So you get down, muscle, bone. So you're really just beating the crap out of everything kind of senselessly. And you could be shutting down your muscles and what we call desensitizing the muscle spindles. So they're not going to contract how they should. And that's something we test here with the digital dynamometer. So you can actually see the force output go down from trying to stretch it out or smash it. And then, people say you have a knot in your muscle. It doesn't mean you need to beat on it. That could be a protective mechanism. If you have a fan-shaped muscle and the bottom part isn't contracting efficiently, so the top part kind of tightens up to compensate, the whole industry needs to think back, especially, physical therapists, and think, okay, why is this happening, instead of just addressing the symptom.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting. You talk about a lot of these programs. Baseball is baseball. It just kind of does its own thing. It's been doing its own thing for decades. And a lot of it is stretching. They're stretching in the beginning. Even the program I'm at, I'm not a head coach, so I'm not going to tell the head coach, the skipper, what to do. I'm just doing the hitting thing, and I'm doing it part-time. But they're stretching, like the infielders and thing. They're doing the Brexit, or not the Brexit. What is it? The Bretzel. The Bretzel, the Brett, what's his face? Pretzel type of thing. He's an FMS type guy, the Bretzel. So they're doing stuff like that right before practice. And you got big guys, small guys, skinny guys, stronger guys, a lot of muscle. And I see that, and I understand. Again, I'm not as in depth as you when it comes to the human body, biomechanics, MAT stuff, but I know that the stretching early on is not good. Is stretching even at the end? Is it even relevant for static stretching?
So not to completely damn stretching. There is a place for it. It's just not as often as we think. So after the activity, yeah, it's probably fine. Especially if it gives you some short-term relief, then it's not a bad thing. Depending on which stretch you're doing. If you're, cranking across here or going this way, causing impingement to muscles that are already fatigued, it's not going to be a good thing. So, we always say the dosage determines the poison. Obviously, if you're holding or forcing a static stretch for a long period of time, don't expect to perform well after that. But, even as a natural reaction, when something starts to cramp up, you stretch it, right? Because your brain knows if I stretch that and take it, to end range, I can shut it down and stop that involuntary contraction from happening.
Yeah. Interesting. I just want some people to understand that out there on the stretching. The stretching can be a good thing, but there's certain times for it. Right. Let's go into the weighted ball stuff. So I'm not a big fan of it. I don't really like my players doing weighted balls. I've had some of my hitters do them, big, strong guys, sophomores, juniors in high school. And these guys can lift 400 pounds in a deadlift or more. And they start weighted ball training and they came close. I mean, very lucky to blowing out their elbow or their shoulder or whatever. They had to sit on the shelf. It was right before, it was kind of preseason, just before the season. He had enough time to recover from it, but it was 2-3 weeks. He had to sit out, couldn't really throw anything because of the weighted ball stuff. So go into that a little bit. I know the argument is, well, they throw a football, or they throw a water polo ball, or they throw, that kind of thing. So go into that a little bit on the weighted ball thing.
And with those arguments, the mechanics are different. With the weighted ball, it's a tool. It's not, that having one, in your baseball bag is going to injure your arm, but it's how you're using it. So as your forearm flexors get tired, that's the only thing crossing over the medial elbow to protect, the connective tissue there. So the UCL. So there's a good study that was done with Modis, I think Brittany Dowling and Ben Hansen, on fatigue unit models. So they saw that the more tired your forearm flexors got, the higher your elbow stress goes up as far as the Newton meters of force. So if we've got more of a force demand, on our forearm flexors and they're fatiguing, and then we've got more mass that's going back. So think about if you're sitting on a traffic light and you stomp on the gas, inertia and object's resistance to change. So your head kind of goes back. But if you had a rolling start, it's not as bad. But it's just a comparison. Or another analogy is, if I place a 5-pound weight on your foot or drop one. So force equals mass times acceleration. So, if a lot of these guys can't keep their arm healthy without a weighted ball, adding a weighted ball to the equation is probably one of the worst things you could do. And I'm not saying there's not a safe way to do it. For me personally, I think the only thing that should be done with a weighted ball would be like this motion, but straight down to the ground, because the elbow is a hinge joint. So we have flexion and extension. So when we go back this way and the forearm and the ball are going back and the humerus torques forward, that's when we get that distraction force or that dynamic valgus. So that's the only thing I would do with one, is take it and fire it straight down into the ground, because anatomically we're not violating, the structure or function. So yeah, it is going to be, stress on the forearm flexors, but that could be a good stress that we could, kind of transfer over to velocity. So that's what I always recommend, for people that are forced to use the weighted balls. And we actually have a Major League Spring Training pitching coordinator that got them for that reason, is because we can offload a significant amount of stress using the Kinetic Arm if they have to go through the weighted ball program. So you can still get whatever the positive benefits may be. But as far as trying to ramp up the workload with them, there has to be a time period for that, physiological adaptation, or basically your body responding to handling that heavier load. Like if you just start lifting heavier weights all the time and your body's not ready for it, something's probably going to tear. So there's a lot of problems with it, but again, it's a tool. If used correctly in only a few ways, you could get some benefit from it. But I think it's just kind of risk versus reward. And unfortunately, a lot of the coaches and even, the people that think they're experts and instructors still don't have the education or understand, kind of the micro progressions needed so that you don't have a blowout.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I think health and safety have to be forefront and priority. I mean, we're doing pitch count craziness at our little league games, which is fine. Like that's a good thing. Right. But that doesn't fix the mechanics if they're wrong or anything like that. It just says you can only pitch 40 pitches or else you can't pitch the next game or whatnot. I want to really dig into the Kinetic Arm, but right before we get there, one of the other things out there, the force plates. So I think another program really puts pressure on the force plate stuff. So talk a little bit about that. I mean, you don't have to talk a ton about it, but just a little bit about what people have to be a little bit leery about when it comes to the metrics that we're getting out of that and what that means.
So with the force plates, I've been at a couple schools where they've spent, I mean, $50,000, $75,000, on these force plates. And, with motion capture, I call it the motion capture myth. It's a superficial assumption of gross motor function, which means you've got all this stuff flying through space and you're really just trying to guess at what you think is not working. So with a force plate, when the foot hits the ground, so just walking as an example, it goes from a bag of bones to a rigid lever. So you absorb force and then you push off. So with a force plate, what it's not telling you that you need to know, and I've had, several professional and college pitchers in here where they had an issue with foot function. And then they had a lot of problems with their elbow and their shoulder because they're not getting that ground reaction force. So with a force plate, it's not telling you when kind of that medial arch that would absorb and then produce force. So like pronation, supination, it's just kind of telling you when everything is pushing against the force plate versus how efficiently it's able to go from a bag of bones to a rigid lever and push off. So it's almost like I had a guy that was at Vanderbilt, throwing 100 miles an hour. Now he's with, I think low A Braves affiliate, and he's struggling to hit low 90s. Well, he couldn't hold a positional contraction with any of the foot function tests. So he's almost standing in a sand pit trying to push off as hard as he can and throw. And wouldn't you know it, he's had a torn lat. He's had all kinds of shoulder issues. So it's, not to say it's like, throwing on ice would be another good example where we completely take away friction and then you're really having to compensate. But if he were to stand in sand and try to throw as hard as he could, the back foot is going to be kind of mushy. So the arm's going to have to work harder. And not to say that it's not great to have all this information, but I always ask people, it's great to have that data. Now, what are you going to do with it? And they say, oh, we pass it off. And I said, stop right there. If you don't understand it, why are you collecting it? Because the PT that you're passing it off to, they don't have an understanding for that. They don't have the skill set to test, all those positions and make sure things are functioning efficiently. So it's interesting when all that stuff gets thrown in the mix. And I think that's a big problem with baseball is nobody wants to put in the time to learn how to actually identify and solve these problems when they could just pick up their phone and learn how to use an app and give you these pretty pictures and images and, this data that, really doesn't mean much in the grand scheme of things, but it makes them look like they know what they're doing and it builds value in what they're selling. So that's why it's just going to keep kind of continuing.
I agree totally. And on the baseball side, it's the launch angle game. It's the launch angles. It's the attack angles. It's the ball exit speeds, all those numbers. And Hit Tracks is probably the most famous. We call it a really, really expensive calculator. It's fun. It's like a video game, right? It's 15 to 25K, maybe even more now with inflation, 30K. But again, what are you going to do with those numbers? Like when you see these numbers, you see the averages, you see all that kind of stuff. How do we increase ball exit speed? How does it decrease? All that kind of stuff. So we deal with the same type of thing. So let's get into the kinetic arm, Jason. So the kinetic arm, I think the two things after our conversation that I picked up, and you can go into a little bit more depth on them, is two things that the kinetic arm does. Number one is it reduces stress on the elbow, shoulder, reduces stress. So it lowers risk for injury. Not saying that you're not going to get injured, but lowers risk for injury. And the other thing is it guides the arms into the right positions. Is that about right? Or is there something you can add to that?
Yeah. So it does a lot of different things. So we actually have a muscle on our lower body called the sartorius that crosses two joints. So if you were to lift your knee up and bring your foot to the outside, so rotate your femur internally and then bring it the other way, that muscle would shorten. So that's kind of the premise on what I made. It's like an external muscular system. So it crosses two joints. So when the arm goes back, there's a compressive element going this way. And then it also kind of cuts this lever in half. So we're able to offload a lot of stress from the elbow, and then it works like an external rotator cuff. So the further back your arm goes, especially into external rotation, it's going to give some assistance in bringing it, back into a stronger position. So some people will say, well, won't you build a tolerance to it? No, because if you look at muscle strength on a bell curve, mid-range, it's the strongest, and then end range, it drops off. So we're just assisting, the muscular system in its weakest position.
Mm.
And as that's exploding forward, all the tension goes to the passive connective tissue. So we're just keeping it, safe and stable until it gets to a stronger range. And it's definitely not going to throw the ball for you. So there's not going to be any atrophy because you still have to produce a great amount of force.
Mm-hmm.
So it also prevents the arm from lagging behind, which would cause a lot of stress on that superior anterior labrum, which is what a slap tear is. So we've had a lot of guys rehab using it. We've had a lot of guys throw that had a slap tear and they were able to keep playing. But yeah, there's a lot of mechanical benefits to it.
Yeah. And you're even saying rehabbing actual Tommy John. You have pitchers that are rehabbing from Tommy John and using it, right?
Yeah, we've got a lot of guys. Lance Dobbins is out in Texas. He's been gathering some great data using the motor sensor and driveline pulse. And he's seeing stress reductions of 20 to 30% consistently. Same thing with Javi De Jesus at Ivy Tech using Pitch AI. Same thing. We're seeing around 20 to 30% consistent stress reduction. And then in a lot of physical therapy clinics, it's being used on a daily basis because on their return to throw programs, there's a lot of flaws, especially in like the ASMI return to throw, or if they do throw at this percent or this distance. There's a lot of variables that aren't being accounted for. So with this, we can progress them back to the full weight of, the arm and the ball without just throwing them in there because it's kind of setting them up for failure. So we can better condition the whole body. So the better condition that is, it's going to take more stress off the arm.
Right. And what I love about what you've done with all your data and your research is that you've taken basically done a scientific experiment, use a scientific method where you have a control, right? You have them throwing without it before they've even used it, right? So you got your control. Then you take all your metrics and data when they're using it, when they have the kinetic arm on, and then you have maybe 6 months or a year later or whatever. I don't know what, 3 months after or whatever, but you have them throwing with it after, like not having it on. So you have 3 different data points. So talk a little bit about what your data is coming up with on that.
So we use the motor sensor, and on a couple of the athletes, we did 3 different groups. So we had the baseline throws with just the motor sensor, and then we had them put the sleeve on, and it was all 100% max effort. I said, I want you to put as much stress on your arm as you can. And then I thought, well, let's see what happens when we take it off and they throw. So a lot of times what we see is the velocity will go up a couple miles per hour, but the elbow stress readings are still lower than their baseline throws. So we've got a lot of professional pitchers that like it for that reason. And some college guys too, they'll wear it, while they're warming up or while they're in the bullpen before they come in. So we've got some incredible data, showing again, up to 30% stress reduction consistently. And we posted, I think maybe 9 or 10 of those videos on our YouTube channel. So you can actually
link to that. Yeah, I'll link to that.
Yeah. And you can watch it pitch by pitch.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been great. And then the long-term kind of effect video that we did, I think that was about 1.5 years of that athlete using it. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting to go back and see, how their current stress readings compared to 1.5 years when they first came in and got their baseline readings done. So that athlete actually went from kind of mid 80s to mid 90s, and then went to a weighted ball program, and they, didn't want him using the sleeve. They just wanted him doing weighted balls, blew his arm out, had Tommy John. Gets to his college. The first thing the, pitching coordinator does is hand him a 2-pound ball and tell him that that's good for him. So that's a whole nother interesting conversation. But as far as testing, I thought it would be interesting to make a theoretical model. So I made a video with I call it a multi-axial theoretical model, which means we've got, this way and then also this way. So I put it on the mannequin and I'll drop the arm. You can see it's, it falls down. So there's no tension holding it up. And then I can pull tangential to the axis of where it's attached. And we can actually see how many foot-pounds of force it can offload per degree. So I've never seen that done with anything in orthopedics, especially, in the sports world. So I think just having those data points, it really helps out to illustrate kind of the benefits, especially to the medical professionals, because we got a lot of support from them. So the better their surgical outcomes are and the better their rehab protocols are, the better it makes them look. So that's why they've really been getting involved lately.
Yeah, I love that. And I know, a lot of my followers are hitting people, but, we're talking throwing, but that seems to be everybody's got to throw in the game of baseball or softball. Everybody's got to throw. And that's always the thing is we got safety and being safe and healthy needs to be like number one priority. And we do the same with our hitters. We make sure that they're not arching their back when they're turning. We make sure that their head's not going like this or going like this during their swing, right? We want to make sure it's safe, so their exit speeds are clean, and they're not going to be making all those compensations. Now, I know right now you're focusing, or you're working on trying to put a youth model, get a youth model. So right now there's no youth model, at least available to purchase. You have just the more of the junior high school on up. Is that about right where it's at? And just kind of talk about that, and talk about when that youth model, maybe people can expect that, because I think that's going to be huge. We talked about that. That's your bigger group of people.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see it on the kids. The biggest reason is because there's going to be issues of growing pains. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be little league elbow and little league shoulder, because if you lose ground reaction force, or you have Seaver's disease or Osgood Schlatter's, the arm has to work harder. So this is a way we can get them through that period, and they don't have to quit where they normally would have. So right now the small size fits down to around 5'5", 120 pounds. The youth version, I'm waiting on the final prototypes for that now. So hopefully we should be, getting that into production fairly soon. And that's going to be a slim fit, full sleeve. We've got a couple different designs, but we've got some pretty good data on it. So I'm pretty confident that we're ready, after this next round of sampling. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll have that into production. And that will also be the adult model that'll be easier to wear in games too, because we have a lot of college and high school athletes that wear it in games right now and just wear a sleeve over it. But this next one is going to be such a slim fit that they can just put it on and go out there. It's a solid color, and it'll be, very easy to wear for the full game.
Cool. So that was a couple of questions that some of the guys had at the high school was, hey, can I wear this in a game? So they can. They just have to have a sleeve over it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pitchers have had a sleeve over it. Position players have left it exposed. We even had a catcher that was wearing it over his jersey under his catcher's gear. I wouldn't recommend it. Just you never know what the umpires are going to assume that it is. Mm-hmm. But I think it's been questioned 1, maybe 2 times, and they just said it's an elbow brace. My PT told me I have to wear it. And then, once the umpires understand that there's kind of a medical necessity, then they don't really question it. So,
I love that, man. When you get this youth model, that would be huge, because you can get it in. I mean, you can get it in the challenge to these little league programs, whether it's Cal Ripken or like we're in a league called River Park Little League. And I couldn't imagine that would be great. Like everybody's pitching is wearing them. And I think that would really help. And the pitch count thing, again, it's just kind of I think it's more of a Band-Aid. It is what it is. But if they're wearing the sleeve too, and you're taking pressure off the elbow, and you're teaching good movements with the kids, because they're horrible right now. We're talking 9 years old, 8, 9, 10-year-old. So there's shot putting going on and all kinds of stuff. So man, I'm excited for that youth model to come out. So definitely let me know, and then I'll let my group know. But before, be respectful of your time, where can people find you, Jason? So website, social media, YouTube, all that good stuff.
So on all the social media platforms, it's at the Kinetic Arm. The website's thekинeticarm.com. YouTube is the Kinetic Arm. We've got a lot of good information on there. You can look at the testing we did, the data we gathered. It's also a good explanation of shoulder structure and function. So definitely check that out, so you have a good understanding of, when somebody tells you shouldn't work upper traps. No, that's incorrect. It's a great scapular upward rotator. So just gives a good breakdown of structure and function, how what role the muscular system plays. And if there's any questions, feel free to shoot them out. I'd love to make more content and, help out with the educational side. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. I watched a couple of the videos on your website. You can just go to, just make sure it's thekинeticarm.com. So you get the real deal, but the videos are shot very well. The data is presented very easily. It's not, if you don't feel like you're not a big data guy, you can understand it for sure. I mean, if I can understand it, I'm not a dummy per se when it comes to data, but yeah, I mean, it has to be dumbed down a little bit, especially when it comes to something like this. So definitely go check those out, and I'll link to all those in the show notes and all that kind of stuff. So, hey, I want to thank you, Jason, for coming on today. And hopefully, we've got so much other content that we can talk about, not just the Kinetic Arm, but we can talk hitting and all kinds of other things. So I'm sure we'll have a part 2, 3, 4 in the future. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time today to jump on the Swing Smarter Hitting Training podcast.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason.